No one returned after fighting humanity, until one survivor brought a warning. Part 1. There was a rule in the galaxy that nobody wrote down, because nobody needed to. It was the kind of rule that wrote itself in the absence of things, in empty star charts, in missing fleet signals, in memorial records that kept getting longer every few decades. The rule was simple. You did not go to war with humanity. Not because they asked you not to. Not because they threatened you. But because everyone who had ever tried was gone, and gone completely, and the universe had not offered a single explanation for where they went. The Galactic Conclave kept the records. It was a gathering of more than 60 species, old and young, spread across a wide arm of the Milky Way. They had observatories and sensor arrays and tracking networks that could follow a single ship from one end of known space to the other. For 300 years, those networks had watched 11 different civilizations send their war fleets toward a small blue planet orbiting a yellow star. 11 times, the sensors had tracked the fleets crossing into human space. 11 times, the signals had gone quiet. No wreckage came back. No escape pods. No distress calls bleeding through subspace. The fleets went in and the universe swallowed them whole and gave nothing back. The Conclave had put up boundary buoys around human space. Big ones, easy to see, broadcasting on every frequency in 40 different languages. The message on each buoy was short. It said, "Do not proceed." No exceptions. Most species read the message, looked at the records, and turned their ships around. The buoys had been very effective. For almost 60 years, no one had crossed the boundary. Then the Vreth arrived. The Vreth were not a young civilization. They had been building warships for 4 centuries and using them constantly. They were tall creatures, gray-skinned, with flat wide faces and black eyes that sat deep in their skulls. Their culture had one measure for everything, one way of deciding the worth of a person, a city, a planet, or a species. That measure was conquest. If you had taken something, you were strong. If you had not, you were nothing. It was a simple philosophy, and it had served them well for a long time, because the species they had gone to war with had all been smaller and weaker and less prepared than the Vreth. Their emperor was a creature called Voss. He had ruled for 40 years. In those 40 years, he had absorbed 19 civilizations, taken their worlds, broken their fleets, and added their names to a long list he kept in his throne room. He was not a stupid being. He understood strategy and logistics and the value of patience. But he had never, not once, lost. And a being that has never lost stops being able to imagine it. When the Conclave sent its advisement, a careful, formally worded document delivered through 3 separate diplomatic channels, explaining the history of human space, the 11 missing fleets, the boundary buoys, and the strong recommendation that the Vreth find a different direction to expand, Voss read it once. Then he set it on the edge of his desk and called his fleet commanders. He told them to build the largest war fleet the Vreth Empire had ever assembled. It took them 2 years. When it was finished, the fleet sat in the dark outside Vreth space like a small metal moon. 4,000 ships. Carriers large enough to hold entire armies. Destroyers with weapons that could split rock. Siege platforms that moved slowly but could crack a planet's surface open like an egg. Soldiers counted not in thousands but in tens of millions. Voss looked at it on his display screen and called it the final correction. He said that word, final, the way someone says a word they enjoy the taste of. The fleet moved. The Conclave tracking network picked it up the moment it crossed into open space. Every observatory in the network flagged it. The readings came in from 100 different sensors, all saying the same thing. The Vreth war fleet was moving toward the human boundary, and it was the biggest single military force the tracking network had ever recorded. In the Conclave central chamber, on a station that floated at a comfortable distance from any potential conflict, the council elder sat at the head of a long table and looked at the display. Her name was Solvith. She was old by the standards of her species, which meant she was very old indeed, and she had served on the council for 200 years. She had watched the 8th fleet disappear, and the 9th, and the 10th, and the 11th. She had written the memorial records herself for the last 4. She looked at the size of the Vreth fleet for a long time without saying anything. Her aide was a young male named Orn, only 40 years into his service, still at the age where large numbers felt impressive rather than sad. He was watching the display with wide eyes and breathing a little faster than normal. "Should we send another advisement?" he asked. Solvith looked at him. Then she looked back at the display. "No," she said. "Begin drafting the memorial record." Orn stared at her. "But they haven't even reached the boundary yet." "I know," she said. "I want it ready. It will save time." She turned back to the window that looked out at the stars, and she folded her hands on the table, and she waited with the particular patience of someone who already knows how the story ends. The Vreth fleet crossed the boundary buoys 4 days later. The buoys broadcast their warnings. The warnings were received and ignored. Fleet Commander Zorel, a decorated veteran of 19 campaigns who had a wall of commendations in his quarters and had never once retreated, stood on the bridge of the lead carrier and looked at the yellow star ahead. He had read the Conclave's advisement. He had read the history of the 11 missing fleets. He had looked at the numbers: 4,000 ships, tens of millions of soldiers, weapons capable of planetary destruction, and he had concluded, as Voss had concluded before him, that the previous fleets had simply not been large enough. That was the only explanation that made sense. 11 failures meant 11 insufficient forces. This force was not insufficient. This force was the largest in Vreth history. There was nothing in human space, or anywhere else, that could stand against it. Zorel looked at the yellow star and felt very little. He was not excited. Excitement was for young officers on their first campaign. He was simply ready. He had been ready for things like this his entire career. His second-in-command, a young officer named Drev, stood beside him and looked at the same star. Drev was on his first deep space campaign. He was trying very hard not to show that he was excited. "No response to our entry signal," said the sensor officer. "No defensive formations detected," said the tactical officer. "No movement from the inner system," said another. Zorel said nothing. He nodded once, slowly, and moved to his command chair and sat down. The fleet moved forward through the dark. Around them, the stars were very still and very far away, and the yellow star ahead grew slowly, degree by degree, brighter than the rest. There was no sound in space, of course. But if there had been, what the Vreth fleet would have heard, stretching out ahead of them from the direction of that quiet blue planet, was exactly nothing. The humans were not running. They were not broadcasting emergency signals. They were not evacuating. They were doing something the Vreth did not have a name for, because the Vreth had never had reason to develop that particular vocabulary. They were waiting. And somewhere on the other side of that yellow star, in a lab that smelled of old coffee and dry erase markers, a woman named Dr. Elaine Ford was looking at a whiteboard covered in numbers and thinking that she finally had enough power to run a real test. #No one returned after fighting humanity, until one survivor brought a warning. Part 2. Captain Leon Graves had been in the Earth colonial fleet for 22 years. He had seen equipment failures, engine fires, hull breaches, pirate skirmishes, and one very strange incident near Jupiter that nobody in command was allowed to talk about. He was not a man who startled easily, and he was not a man who used more words than a situation required. So when the long-range sensors on the bridge of the ECS Ardent Shore lit up with 4,000 contact signatures dropping out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of the outer marker, he looked at the screen for about 4 seconds, then pressed his comm. "Admiral," he said, "the Vreth are here. It's a big one. You'll want to see this." That was all he said. Then he poured himself a glass of water from the carafe on the edge of his console and waited. Admiral Patricia Cole arrived on the command deck of Fleet Station Meridian 14 minutes later. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with short gray hair and the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. She was carrying a mug of coffee. Her reading glasses were pushed up on her forehead. She had clearly been in the middle of something before the call came, and she had not hurried, not because she was careless, but because she was the kind of person who understood that the situation would still be the same size whether she ran or walked. She looked at the sensor display for a long time. The dots were arranged in a formation that filled most of the screen. The numbers beside the formation kept updating. Weapons signatures. Drive signatures. Mass readings. All of it enormous. She took a sip of her coffee. "How long until they reach the outer marker?" she asked. The tactical officer was a young man named Aaron Vance. He was 27 years old and had been on station for 8 months, and nothing in his training had fully prepared him for looking at 4,000 enemy ships on a live sensor feed. He was holding himself very still in the way that people do when they are afraid that moving will make things worse. 62 hours at current speed, he said. All right, said Admiral Cole. Get me Earth Command. And someone wake up Dr. Ford. She's been asking for full power allocation for 3 weeks and I think she's going to be very happy this morning. Dr. Elaine Ford was not in her quarters when the call came. She was in her lab, which was on sublevel 4 of Fleet Station Meridian and which she had quietly colonized over 9 years until it was entirely hers. The lab was large and always slightly cold, the way labs get when someone leaves the ventilation set too high and never bothers to fix it because they never notice. There were 3 whiteboards along the main wall, all of them full. There was a folding table in the corner with a coffee maker that had not been cleaned in a month. There were stacks of printed calculations because Dr. Ford did not trust anything important to screens alone. She was standing at the main whiteboard with a marker in her hand when the comm came through. I saw them on the passive array 40 minutes ago, she said before the comm officer could speak. Tell Patricia I need 48 hours and full power allocation to the aft array. She got both. The next 48 hours on Fleet Station Meridian were quiet in a way that confused the younger crew members. They had expected something. Red alerts. Evacuation drills. Emergency meetings with people shouting over each other and pointing at maps. Instead, the senior staff were calm. The corridors were normal. Mess hall was open on schedule. Admiral Cole had 2 more meetings that afternoon that had nothing to do with the Vreth, one about supply routing and one about a personnel complaint that had been sitting on her desk for 2 weeks. Down on sublevel 4, Dr. Ford and her team worked without stopping. There were 6 people on her core team. None of them slept more than 3 hours during those 48 hours. They did not talk much. They had been working on the same project for 9 years, and at this stage, they communicated mostly in numbers and short phrases and the kind of looks that develop between people who have spent too much time in the same cold room solving the same impossible problem. The project had several official names in the fleet's administrative records, all of them vague and technical sounding. The team called it the Array. What it was, in simple terms, was a way of asking the universe to stop making a decision it had already made, to take something that existed and make it not exist, completely and immediately, without the usual intermediate steps of fire and pressure and scattering debris. Dr. Ford had described it once, at a review meeting 3 years earlier, as the least complicated thing I have ever built, conceptually. The math is what takes time. The Vreth fleet continued to move through human space. At the 60-hour mark, Fleet Commander Zorel ordered a general hail, a broadcast on all frequencies, announcing the fleet's presence and demanding the immediate surrender of all human colonies and installations. There was no answer. Zorel stood at his viewport and looked at the dark. The yellow star was much brighter now. The inner planets were visible on the sensors. Everything was still. The humans had not moved a single ship. They are hiding, said Drev, standing beside him. There is nothing to hide behind, said the sensor officer. Drev did not have an answer for that. Zorel said nothing. He was watching the star and feeling that itch again, that small, nameless thing at the back of his mind that he did not like and could not identify. In 19 campaigns, he had faced enemies who ran, enemies who masked their defenses, enemies who tried to negotiate, enemies who fought until the very last ship was burning. He had never faced an enemy who simply did nothing. It did not fit any category he had been trained to understand. He told himself it was fear. He told himself the humans were paralyzed. He had seen it before in weaker species. The moment the scale of an approaching force became clear, something in them simply stopped working, and they could not move or decide or act. He had always found it a little sad. He told himself that. On the 61st hour, in the cold lab on sublevel 4, Dr. Elaine Ford looked at her power readings. She looked at her field calibration numbers. She looked at the team around her, and each of them looked back, and without anyone saying anything, a decision was made the way decisions are made between people who know each other very well. "Run it," she said. The array hummed. The power draw spiked across the whole station, lights dimmed for a moment in the corridors above, and Aaron Vance at his tactical console felt the slight vibration that big machinery always sends through a station's frame. He looked at his sensor screen. 4,000 signals. Then none. He sat very still and looked at the empty screen. There was no explosion. No cloud of debris expanding outward. No energy discharge he could measure. The signals had been there and then they were not, the way a word disappears when you erase it from a page. He checked the sensors. He ran a diagnostic. He checked again. "Admiral," he said, and his voice came out smaller than he intended. Admiral Cole was already looking at her own screen. Down on sublevel 4, Dr. Ford was reading the output data. Her field decay numbers were slightly higher than her model had predicted. She wrote this down. She wrote down 3 other numbers. She pulled the cap off her marker, looked at the whiteboard, and added a note about reducing the power coefficient by 12%. Then she picked up her comm and left a short audio message for the station's technical log. "Residual field decay within expected parameters," she said. "No observable secondary effects. Recommend reducing power coefficient by 12% for the next test. Don't want to clip the boundary buoys." She capped the marker. She set down the comm. She looked at the whiteboard for another moment, then wrote one more number in the corner. Around her, the team was already moving to the next set of readings. Upstairs, Aaron Vance was still staring at an empty sensor screen, breathing carefully, trying to decide what to put in the official report for a section that was supposed to be labeled Enemy Fleet Status. Admiral Cole finished her coffee and set the mug down on the edge of the console. "File the report," she said. "Full documentation. I want everything written up before anyone starts asking questions we're not ready to answer." She looked at the empty screen one more time. Then she picked up her reading glasses, settled them on her nose, and went back to the personnel complaint she had been working on earlier. It still needed to be resolved. The station still needed to run. There were things to do. There were always things to do. #No one returned after fighting humanity, until one survivor brought a warning. Part 3. The Conclave tracking network was very good at its job. It had been built over 2 centuries by many species contributing their best sensor technology, and the result was something that could track a single ship across light years, identify its drive signature, estimate its crew count, and flag anything unusual before a living being even had time to notice it. The operators who monitored it worked in long shifts and spent most of their time watching nothing, because space was mostly nothing, and that was expected. On the day the Vreth fleet disappeared, the network registered the event the same way it had registered the disappearance of 11 fleets before it. One moment there was a large cluster of signals moving inward through human boundary space. The next moment there was not. The system flagged the absence, logged the timestamp, and sent alerts to the relevant council offices. In the administrative records, a file was opened under the Vreth Empire's name. Counselor Salvatha's office received the alert, and her aide Orn confirmed that the memorial record she had begun drafting 3 days earlier was now ready to be finalized. It was, by any measure, an ordinary event. Terrible, but ordinary, in the specific way that things become ordinary when they happen enough times. The network updated its records. The boundary buoys were checked remotely and found to be functioning correctly. The usual advisements were prepared for member species who might ask questions. Council Salvath signed the memorial record and submitted it to the archive. And then, 17 days later, something happened that the network had never flagged before. Not once, in 300 years, in 11 previous incidents, in all the data it had collected from all the sensors it operated across all of known space. A ship came back out of human boundary space. The alert that appeared on the monitoring station's screen was flagged with a category that several of the younger operators had never seen used in a live situation. The category was labeled simply, "Unexpected Return." There was a note beneath it explaining what the category meant, because it had been added to the system as a theoretical possibility and nobody had ever expected to need it. The ship was very small. It was a scout-class vessel, the kind used for advance reconnaissance ahead of a fleet, fast, lightly built, designed for 2 to 4 crew members and not much else. It was not armed in any meaningful way. Its hull showed damage consistent with pushing its engines too hard for too long. It was moving at a speed that suggested whoever was piloting it had not slowed down since leaving human space, and had perhaps not slept either. It was broadcasting on every frequency it had. All of them at once, which was not normal. The message it was sending, on every channel, in Vreth military code and then again in open language, was 3 words. Let me through. The Conclave border control station nearest to the ship's exit point scrambled an intercept team. 2 patrol vessels moved to meet the incoming ship. They hailed it 7 times before it responded. When it finally did, the voice on the channel was rough and uneven, like something speaking through damage. Whether damage to the equipment or damage to the speaker, the border control officers could not immediately tell. The ship slowed. It stopped. It did not resist when the patrol vessels came alongside and the boarding team crossed over. Inside, they found one Vreth. He was alone. He was young enough that the officers, who knew Vreth physiognomy well enough to make a rough estimate, put him at barely past the age of military conscription. His name, which he gave when asked in a voice that had very little strength left in it, translated as something close to Kale. He had injuries that were not from combat. They were the kind of injuries that happen when a body is pushed too hard for too many days in a row without food or rest. There was dried blood on his hands from a gash on his right arm that had not been properly treated. He had wrapped it himself with a strip of his uniform jacket. He was shaking. It was a fine, constant shaking that did not stop when he was given water and a thermal sheet and a seat that was softer than the pilot's chair he had been in for 17 days. The border control medical officer noted in her report that the shaking did not appear to be caused by his injuries or by cold. She wrote, carefully, that in her assessment it appeared to be caused by fear, and she noted that this was unusual, because the Vreth, as a species, did not have a strong cultural relationship with fear. It was not something their language had many words for. It was not something their military trained them to manage, because their military did not expect them to feel it. Kale was transported to Conclave main station under full medical supervision. He was treated. He was allowed to sleep, something he did for almost 20 hours without waking. When he was finally brought before the emergency council session that had been convened in the days since his arrival, he looked better than he had on the patrol ship, but the shaking had not entirely gone away. Counselor Salveth sat across from him. The room was full of council members and observers and aides, all of them quiet, all of them watching the small young Vreth who had done the one thing no one, had ever done before. Salveth did not begin with formal questions. She looked at him for a moment and then said, simply, "Tell us what happened." Kale spoke for 6 hours. He had not been in the fleet when it crossed the boundary buoys. That was the beginning of everything. He had been assigned to the fleet as part of a scout unit, but his ship had suffered an engine fault during the final approach to the boundary, a failure in the drive coil that his repair systems estimated would take several hours to correct. The fleet had not waited. Fleets of that size did not wait for single scouts. He had been told to follow when he was able. So he had been coasting, 6 light minutes behind the main body of 4,000 ships, when his sensors showed him that the ships ahead had stopped. Not slowed. Not changed formation. Stopped, and then ceased to be on his sensor screen at all. He had checked the sensors. He had run the diagnostics that he was trained to run. He had called on the fleet communications channel and received no answer. He had tried emergency channels. Nothing. He had pointed his long-range array at the space where 4,000 ships had been and found nothing there. No wreckage. No energy dispersion consistent with weapons fire. No chemical traces. No drive residue. Nothing that a fleet leaves when something destroys it. Just empty space, and the yellow star beyond, and the silence of a frequency that had been full of voices 11 minutes ago. Kale sat in his pilot's chair for 11 hours. He said this without embarrassment, and nobody in the council room questioned it. He sat in his chair and looked at his sensor screen and breathed and tried to make his hands work well enough to do something, and for 11 hours they would not. What finally made him move was not a decision, exactly. It was something he had captured on his long-range array during the minutes just after the fleet disappeared. His array had been aligned at an angle that was, in all likelihood, a coincidence of his exact position and his exact heading at that exact moment. It was a narrow window. It lasted less than a minute. And in that window, his equipment had caught a short-range human communication signal that had not been intended for external reception. It was a voice. A human voice, female, speaking in what his translation software identified as a technical communication, the kind of message someone leaves for a system log rather than for a listener. It was short. It was calm. It was the calmest thing Kale had ever heard. Translated as closely as the software could manage, it said something like, residual field decay within expected parameters. No observable secondary effects. Recommend reducing power coefficient by 12% for the next test. Don't want to clip the boundary buoys. Kale played the recording for the council. The room was very quiet. When it finished, Counselor Solveth did not speak immediately. She sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at the middle distance for a while. Then she asked, slowly, the next test. Kale looked at her. The shaking in his hands was visible. Yes, he said. That is why I came back. That is the only reason I turned around. He looked around the room at all of them, at every species, every council member, every observer who had come to see the impossible thing that had walked in off a scout ship. I came back, he said, because someone had to tell you that what destroyed the fleet was not their best weapon. It was a test of a weapon they are still improving. And I did not know what to do with that information alone. The room stayed very quiet for a long time after that. Outside the station's wide windows, the stars were the same as they had always been. Still, and very far apart, and completely indifferent to the small beings gathered in the room below them, trying to understand what they had just heard. #No one returned after fighting humanity, until one survivor brought a warning. Part 4. The conclave emergency session lasted 9 days. It was the longest session in the Council's recorded history, longer even than the sessions after the third and fourth fleet disappearances, when several member species had come close to open disagreement about what humanity represented. Back then, the debates had been long and heated and had eventually ended without resolution, mostly because nobody could agree on what the facts meant. This session was different. This time, the facts were very specific, and what they meant was the thing everyone was arguing about. Kale's testimony was available in full to all council members. The recording of the 6 hours he had spoken had been transcribed, translated into every relevant language, and distributed before the first session even opened. The audio capture of Dr. Ford's voice, 6 seconds, calm, technical, unaware it was being heard, had been played at the end of the second session for the full council. After that, several members requested that it be played again. Then again. By the end of the fourth day, it had been played 47 times in official session, and considerably more than that in the smaller meetings that happened in corridors and offices and the cafeteria on the station's lower levels. The debates went in many directions at once. Some council members argued for military response. They said the information Kale had brought back was a threat, that a species with a weapon of that scale, that was still testing and improving it, was a danger to every other species in the galaxy regardless of their past behavior. They said the conclave needed to act before humanity finished whatever they were building. These arguments were loud and came from several of the more militarily capable member species, and they took up a great deal of time in the first 3 days. Other members argued for strengthening the isolation. More buoys. A wider exclusion zone. Formal agreements between member species never to approach human space, enforced by conclave law rather than just advisement. They said the safest thing was simply to make the boundary stronger and hope that humanity, who had never expanded beyond it unprovoked, would continue to stay inside it. Several members, mostly the smaller and less militarily confident species, argued for formal diplomatic contact. They said the conclave had spent 300 years treating humanity as a danger to be avoided rather than a civilization to be understood, and that this was not only ineffective but possibly dangerous in a different way, that a species as powerful as humanity, kept isolated for 3 centuries, might eventually decide on its own what to do about its neighbors, and that giving them no input into that decision was unwise. The Thale sent a delegation. The Thale had not spoken formally to the conclave in 80 years. They were a very old species, slow-moving and deliberate, and they did not involve themselves in things they considered beneath their attention. The fact that they had come at all was noted by everyone. The fact that their delegation said almost nothing for the first 4 days was also noted, in a different way. Counselor Solveth did not speak at all for the first 4 days. She sat at the head of the table and listened. She asked questions sometimes, small, specific questions, the kind that clarify a single point rather than redirect a debate. She let the arguments run. She had learned, over 200 years of council service, that arguments needed to run before they could be finished, and cutting them off early only meant they came back later in worse forms. On the 5th day, She asked for silence, and received it. She did not use notes. She looked around the room for a moment, at all of them, and then she began to speak. "We have been treating this as a military question," she said. "It is not. It is a different kind of question entirely." She pulled up the history on the display, not just the Vreth incident, but all of it. 300 years. 11 civilizations. 11 fleets. The memorial records, one after another, each one the same as the last except for the name at the top. "Every civilization that went to war with humanity went first," she said. "Every one. Humanity did not go to them. Humanity did not send ships across the boundary to threaten them. Humanity did not expand into their space. In 300 years, humanity has not taken a single colony, a single station, a single resource from another species by force. What they have done, every time, without exception, is wait until someone came to them with hostile intent, and then respond." She paused. The room was very quiet. Dr. Ford's note was not a threat, she said. It was a researcher's memo. The weapon that ended 4,000 ships was, to the person who designed it, a test that did not yet meet her own standards. She was not celebrating. She was not grieving. She was writing down what she needed to fix. The 4,000 ships were not, from her perspective, the point of the exercise. The calibration data was the point of the exercise. A council member from one of the more aggressive military species made a sound that was the equivalent of a sharp protest. Solvith looked at them and they did not speak. "This is not an argument for or against humanity," she said. "This is an observation about what the evidence shows. And what the evidence shows is a civilization that has had, for 3 centuries, the capacity to expand into other species' space and has consistently chosen not to. A civilization that has been attacked 11 times by forces ranging from small to enormous, and has responded each time with a level of force exactly sufficient to end the attack, and nothing more. No pursuit. No retaliation. No expansion. They remove the threat and they go back to what they were doing." The Thale observer raised a hand. It was the first time any member of their delegation had moved in 2 days. "What were they doing?" he asked. "Between incidents. What has humanity been doing in the time between these attacks?" Solvith looked at him. She had been waiting for someone to ask this. "Building," she said. "Researching. Improving. Dr. Ford has been working on the array for 9 years. It is not their only project. The fleet station it is housed on is not their only station. 300 years of being left alone, largely, except for these attacks. 300 years is a long time to work on things without interruption." The room was very still. "Kale did not bring us a warning about what humanity intends to do to us," she said. "Kale brought us a warning about what happens to species that make humanity do anything at all. The warning is not new. It has been written into the memorial records 11 times. We have simply been reading it as a record of humanity's danger to others. What it is, actually, is a record of others' danger to themselves." She let that sit for a moment. "The question before us is not how to defend against humanity. They have not attacked us. They have not threatened us. The question before us is whether we are going to keep doing the thing that 11 civilizations have done before us, treating a powerful and patient species as a problem to be solved, or whether we are going to do the thing that nobody has yet tried." She closed the display. "Talk to them," she said. "Not as a threat. Not as a negotiation between enemies. Simply talk to them. Because in 300 years, in 11 incidents, not one civilization has ever done that before picking up a weapon, and perhaps it is time to find out what happens when someone does." The room was quiet for a long time after she finished. The Thale observer lowered his hand. He looked at his colleagues, who looked back at him. Then he looked at Solvith. "We will support this," he said. It was the first thing the Thale had said in public council in 80 years. Several of the younger aides did not immediately understand the significance of it. The older council members did. Solvith nodded once, slowly. Outside the windows, the stars were still. The boundary buoys, somewhere far across the dark, were still broadcasting their message to anyone who would listen. Most species had learned to listen. It was time, Solvith thought, to do something harder than listening. It was time to speak. No one returned after fighting humanity, until one survivor brought a warning. Part 5. The diplomatic team that the conclave assembled was the most experienced one it had. That was not an accident. Counselor Solvith had been very specific about what kind of people she wanted, not the most decorated, not the most politically connected, but the ones who had spent the most time actually talking to species that were very different from themselves and had come away from those conversations with something useful. She chose 7. She chose them carefully. She gave them 4 months to prepare. She also, at the last moment, added an 8th name to the list. It was Kale's. This caused some debate. Kale was not a diplomat. He was a young Vreth who had survived something no one else had survived and had then done the difficult thing of coming back to report it. He had been living on Conclave Station for 2 years by then, in a set of quarters that had been converted to match Vreth environmental preferences, working a modest administrative job that the council had found for him because he had nowhere else to go. The Vreth Empire had not asked for him back. The Vreth Empire was, at the moment, occupied with the very large problem of having sent 4,000 ships into human space and received nothing in return. Solvith said Kale was coming because he was the only being alive, outside of humanity itself, who had been close enough to a human weapon discharge to collect data on it, and because he had shown more clear judgment in a terrible situation than most trained diplomats showed in comfortable ones. Nobody argued with her twice on the same point. That was a thing people had learned about Solvith over 200 years. The delegation traveled to the boundary in a mid-sized conclave vessel, not a warship, not a luxury transport, something in between. They sent a communication ahead of them, on open frequencies, in every human language that conclave translation archives contained. The message was simple and direct, because Solvith had written it herself and she did not like unnecessary words. It said that the conclave was sending a diplomatic team to request a meeting, that the team was unarmed, that it would stop at the boundary and wait for as long as necessary, and that the conclave would understand completely if humanity chose not to respond. The response came in 11 hours. It was a set of coordinates and a time window, transmitted in clean standard notation, with a brief note from the human side that said, "Come to these coordinates at this time and we will meet you there. Bring however many people you want. There will be food." The delegation spent several minutes reading the last line. Solvith's aide Orn, who had been with her since before the Vreth incident, read it 3 times and then said he did not know how to interpret it. "It means they are going to feed us," said Solvith. "Prepare accordingly." The meeting took place on a human orbital station, not a military installation, as several team members had expected, but a civilian research station that had been fitted with a meeting room large enough for both delegations. The humans had clearly done some quick work to make the room comfortable for non-human species. The temperature was set lower than most humans preferred, there were chairs of several different designs, and the air composition had been adjusted to a neutral mix that would not irritate the respiratory systems of the conclave species present. On the table, there was food. A great deal of food, of many different kinds. Some of it human, some of it clearly sourced from other places and prepared in unfamiliar ways. There was also a large selection of drinks, including at least 6 varieties of tea. The human delegation was led by Deputy Ambassador Carl Hoover. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, with dark hair going gray at the sides, an easy smile, and the kind of handshake that was warm without being aggressive. He introduced himself to each conclave delegate personally, using their name correctly on the first try, and then stepped back and let the space breathe rather than filling it immediately with words. Beside him sat Dr. Elaine Ford. She had come at humanity's own request. Solvith had been told this in advance and had thought about it carefully. The fact that humanity had chosen to include the person who had designed and operated the array was not, she had decided, a provocation. It was honesty. The humans were not pretending that the array did not exist, or that the last 300 years had not happened, or that everyone in the room was not aware of what had occurred in this solar system 17 months ago. They were acknowledging all of it by putting the relevant person in the room, and in Solvith's long experience, acknowledgement was always a better foundation for conversation than pretense. Dr. Ford had a battered notebook with her. She had ink on the fingers of her right hand. She looked around the meeting room with the particular kind of attention that belongs to people who are professionally interested in almost everything, and when her eyes reached Kale, who was sitting at the far end of the conclave side of the table, she held his gaze for a moment and gave him a small, serious nod. Kale nodded back. His hands were not shaking. They had not shaken, he had noticed, since the moment the human station had come into view through the ship's forward window. Counselor Pyrrha, who led the diplomatic team, had prepared a long formal address. She began delivering it. She got about a third of the way through before Carl Hoover leaned forward slightly and said, very gently, in a tone that managed to be both respectful and completely direct, "Counselor, we've all read the same history. Why don't we skip to the part where we actually talk to each other?" Pyrrha stopped. She looked at him. Then she set down her notes and said, "Yes. All right." They talked for 8 hours. The humans asked questions constantly. About the conclave structure, about how decisions were made, about which species had joined voluntarily and which had joined under pressure, about trade networks and scientific exchange programs and how the tracking network was funded and maintained. They asked about Kale, not about the incident, but about him, about what he had been doing on Conclave Station, about whether he had been treated well, whether he had enough to do, whether there were things the Conclave could have done better to support him. Kale, who had not expected to be asked anything directly, answered carefully and honestly. He said the Conclave had been fair. He said the work was not difficult but it kept him occupied. He said he did not know yet what he wanted to do with the rest of his life, which was a very strange thing for a Vreth to admit in a formal setting, and he was aware of that, but it was true. Dr. Ford had spent the first 2 hours mostly listening, occasionally writing in her notebook. At the 3-hour mark, the Thale observer made a comment about theoretical propulsion mathematics in the context of faster-than-light transit efficiency, and Dr. Ford looked up from her notebook and began to talk. She and the Thale observer talked for 40 minutes. Nobody else in the room could follow what they were saying, but everyone could see that both of them were leaning forward and speaking faster than they had been before, and that this was the most animated either of them had been all day. Carl Hoover watched this with a small, quiet smile and refreshed his tea. Near the end of the 8th hour, Hoover asked the question that had been sitting in the room since the beginning, unasked, taking up space. "Counselor," he said to Pyrrha, "what took 300 years?" Pyrrha looked at him. She looked at Salveth, who said nothing. She looked back at Hoover. "Fear," she said. "And pride." "Mostly fear." Hoover nodded. He did not look satisfied or vindicated. He looked like someone who had expected that answer and found it sad in the way that expected things can be sad. "All right," he said. "What do we do now?" What they did was write an understanding. Not a treaty in the old sense, with pages of legal language and binding clauses and enforcement mechanisms. Something shorter, and in some ways harder, a document that said, in plain words, what both sides were agreeing to do and not do, and why. Humanity would remain within their current boundary. The conclave would maintain the boundary markers and ensure they were always visible and always broadcasting. Both sides would keep channels open. Both sides would talk before any incident could become an event. And any species that crossed the boundary with hostile intent would face humanity without warning, without negotiation, and without the possibility of intervention from the conclave or anyone else. This was not written in the document. It did not need to be. It was simply known, the way the boundary buoys were known, the way the memorial records were known. As the session was ending and people were moving toward the door, Dr. Ford stopped beside Kale. She was shorter than he had expected when he first saw her, now that he was standing close. The notebook was tucked under her arm. "I heard what you did," she said. "Coming back. That took something." Kale looked at her. "I had to," he said. "Someone had to explain what you are." "And what did you tell them?" she asked. Kale was quiet for a moment. He thought about the 4,000 ships. He thought about the 6 seconds of audio and the calm voice he had played 47 times trying to understand it. He thought about sitting in the pilot's chair for 11 hours with hands that would not work. "I told them," he said, "that you are not the strongest species we have ever met. There are older ones. Larger ones. Ones with more ships and more territory." Dr. Ford waited. "I told them that you are the only species we have met that could be the most powerful species any of us has ever encountered," Kale said, "and that you seem to find that fact almost completely uninteresting." Dr. Ford looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled, not a large smile, but a real one. "We have a lot of other things to work on," she said. She tucked the notebook more firmly under her arm and walked out into the corridor. Kale stood in the empty room for a while after the others had gone. He looked at the table, still covered with the remains of the food, and the cups, and the small comfortable disorder of a meeting that had gone well. Outside the station's windows, the stars were the same as always. Still and very far apart and entirely indifferent. But there was something different about looking at them now. He could not immediately name what it was. Then he could. He was not afraid of them anymore. Somewhere in the Conclave's administrative network, a file was being updated. The entry for humanity had carried the same classification for 300 years. A committee of 7 had spent 4 days arguing about what to replace it with, and had finally settled on something that was not quite a warning and not quite a category and not quite anything the classification system had been designed to hold. It was 5 words, and whoever had typed it had not put a period at the end, as if they were not entirely sure the sentence was finished. It read, "Do not. Under any circumstances." And beneath it, added by a junior archivist who had decided, after reading Kale's full testimony, that something more was needed, was a single line that the committee had not approved and that nobody had yet thought to remove. It said, "They are not done yet."